Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I want to take you through some exciting games from the Superbet Chess Classic going on right now in Romania. So there were a lot of interesting games. I want to go over two from today, and if we have time, I want to go over one from round two as well. So we've got a lot to get through tonight. I just want to jump right into it here. So let's jump on over to the show here. Oh, and it's actually looking a little bit jumpy again. I think hopefully it should be fixed now. Sorry for the rough intro there, but I think it's better. Hopefully, it's looking like it might be better. Okay, it is wonderful. Sometimes the tech can be tough to get going here, but we're ready. So the first game I want to go over is a game from today that didn't impact the leaders too much. It's between well, actually did impact the leaders because Alex Grischuk joined the leader with this win over Bogdan-Daniel Deac, who was a last-minute addition to the Romania tournament, of course because Richard Poor unfortunately had to drop out last minute. So Deac has been having a really interesting event thus far, and the interest continues with this game. So the story I want to try to tell with this game, the lesson to take away, I think is one about avoiding risk. So of course, you know, Deac is a phenomenal world-class player at the young age of 19, looking to be a very bright talent for Romania going into the future. But I think in this game, he may have been playing so risk-averse that he ended up taking some risks and losing to Grischuk. And this is a common mistake that I see when players are perhaps a little bit intimidated by their opponent, myself included. I have fallen into this trap personally, and so I want to take a look at what that looks like here. So Grischuk played a relatively tame opening, starting with knight f3, c d5, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, and knight c3. So just a normal Queen's Gambit declined with the knight development. Now Deac plays a very concrete opening variation in the form of c5, so the Semi-Tarrasch in the QGD. Of course, not related to the other openings named after Tarrasch. So what do I mean when I say it's a very concrete line? Well, a lot of times in openings with d4, d5, Black's key break to find equality is with this pawn push to c5. Otherwise, in lines like the Semi-Slav, you're going to see that White has just a little bit of a space advantage. White is applying pressure to Black's center, where Black is taking a more defensive approach, just trying to control the center more passively. Also, of course, White can claim some kind of edge because this dark squared bishop is able to develop outside the pawn chain, while this one, as of yet, is not. And you'll see in openings like this, much later on, Black will occasionally try to push through with c5 to free up the bishop and free up the position in general. With the Semi-Tarrasch, Deac is immediately trying to break in the center and find some sort of equality straight out of the opening. Now, the downside to playing so immediately is that White, of course, has one more piece developed than Black, and for that reason, White is able to get a structural advantage right away. And Grischuk does go for this with c takes d5. We see c takes d4, queen takes d4, and e takes d5. And this is a position reached numerous times. So now, rather than Black playing with a spatial disadvantage, Black is accepting an isolated queen pawn, the Isolani. And this is going to come with its own set of advantages and problems. Basically, if Black can trade this pawn for one of White's pawns, or effectively activate his pieces around the isolated pawn, taking advantage of its central space, then Black will have, in fact, found true equality. However, if White manages to put meaningful pressure against the d5 pawn, and Black is not able to activate around it, then White is going to be left with a little bit of an edge here. Now, a common move in this position is actually pawn to e4, but I think this is simplifying a bit too much. Black is able to develop now with knight c6. We see bishop b5 to pin the knight, but after d takes e4, queen takes d8, king takes d8, Knight g5. The intrigue continues a little bit with bishop to e6, but with the d5 pawn being gone, this is very, very little for white in this position. And historically, you know, something like 80% of the games have been just a dead draw from here. So Grischuk instead chooses to leave some pieces on the board and plays bishop g5, leaving the queens on the board, leaving black with this structural deficit for just a little bit longer. We see bishop b7 by Deac, so far so good. e3, castles kingside, bishop e2. Notably here, white chooses not to bring the bishop out to d3, which is also a fine move. I think in this case because white is looking to apply more pressure down the d file right away. So we get knight c6 by black, queen d3 by white, h6 by Deac, forcing white to make a decision with this bishop now. Of course, one option is to capture on f6, trying to weaken black's control over d5. Of course, though, this wouldn't immediately be the greatest idea in the world, because while you do get this d5 pawn, this bishop's going to be very, very active, and don't forget that black is generally not too unhappy with trading this d5 pawn for another pawn, like the one on b2. And of course, giving up the bishop pair, never something to be done lightly. So bishop h4 instead. Deac comes out now with bishop e6. We get castles and queen b6. So we are nearing sort of the end of the opening phase. White has finally gotten castled. Black has connected the rooks and activated, and so far successfully defended the pawn on d5. And now after a3, we see white managing to defend b2 through sort of tactical means. So of course, this is a very, very common idea for white and in fact black with a6 to defend against a queen taking on b2 or b7. So what's the trick? Well, of course, here I think there's actually two options for white. Number one, of course, rook fb1 in this case. I think actually traps the queen. And maybe a slightly more common trick is actually involved with knight b4, being able to trap the queen. Although here this looks a little bit complicated, but still winning a piece with tactics to follow. Of course, the point of a3 now is that the b4 square is defended so that the queen cannot retreat. a3 also has the nice bonus of somehow defending the a3 square by introducing the rook as a defender, so the queen cannot escape this way either. Whereas here, of course, under similar circumstances, queen a3 or queen b4 would both be playable. So a3, defending the pawn on b2, we see rook fd8 now, just controlling this pawn on d5, and rook fd1. So we are now exiting the opening stage, and black has to find some way to activate around the pawn, continue activating, continue putting on pressure, or to just simply resolve the struggle around the isolated pawn entirely. So I'm curious what you guys in the chat would be able to come up with for black in this position. Because from here on out, so far, Deac has made no really discernible mistakes, just so far playing good opening chess, getting all the pieces in the game, and not really wasting any time doing so. But now I think is where Deac starts to adopt this more risk-averse style, and when you play to avoid all risk, sometimes you start making tiny concessions, and over time, those tiny concessions may start to add up. So we need some way to continue here with the black pieces. Chessbunzo says, looks like they've used a lot of time already. And, well, yeah, if you've got Alex Grischuk with the, in the game, you're going to see a lot of time being used. But somehow, yes, it is only move 14, and Grischuk is down to 34 minutes. Deac as well, down to 48 minutes. So they were thinking for the past couple turns, if I'm not mistaken. Grischuk thinking from very, very early on, and then Deac really using a lot of his time on h6, bishop e6, and queen b6, sort of catching up with Grischuk on the time pressure. So Matt Wilson just wants to play rook a to c8. And yeah, moves like this are perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. But is there any way we can sort of solve black's problems entirely? So rook a8 is one suggestion, but we need perhaps some concrete ideas here. And the thing to remember with this position is that while the Isolani is definitely a double-edged sword, you can rely on it as a static weakness. So of course, borrowing some terminology here from chess authors, but as a static weakness in the long run, this pawn is going to be a weakness, something that can be attacked. Meanwhile, White's position really doesn't have any such weaknesses to speak for. So Black is going to have to make use of the space advantage that this pawn gives him to find activity, create threats somehow, or leverage that advantage in space and activity to fix the weakness. So NJF is saying g5. I think g5 is a little bit much. It's giving yourself more weaknesses. And we're looking to solve our own weaknesses. So Julian Williams in the chat said d4 and then gave up on it. But I do think d4 is actually a really great idea here for Black. I think d4 would be a way for Black to try to solve all of the problems right away. Now, why didn't Black play d4? Well, because it looks a little bit risky. You have to rely on your calculation here, and you do have to calculate quite a bit before you play the move d4. But let's go through some of the lines here. So what happens if White were to capture on d4? We see knight takes d4, e takes d4, rook a to c8, let's say rook d2, and now how can Black fully equalize in this position? There's actually a really clever idea. I've given you a bit of a hint by playing this move rook to c8 for you, but Black is actually able to fully equalize without any further controversy. And the chat room has also come up with the move knight e4, which is actually the move that Deac plays in the game. So you're not doing too badly. That's a 2600 plus level chess move, knight e4. But Black actually has a very clever idea here to resolve the tension. Okay, the chat suggesting bishop c4, but even better than bishop c4 is rook c4, attacking this pawn on d4 yet again, making use of the lateral pin of the bishop on h4, and White simply has no good response to this move. If you try d5, this pawn is hanging, you can't, or this bishop's hanging, you can't take because of the pin, and if you try to trade first and then play d5, what's going on here, chat room? What's going on here? Sorry, I have too many things. So yes, the surprising move rook d4 now makes use of this bishop being drawn out to f6, and now Black is actually able to recapture this pawn. I believe just straight up, right? This rook is defended twice, attacked twice, and there's somehow this very strange configuration of Black pieces. It looks very sort of geometrically pleasing, but it gets the job done. And so these are the type of complications that I think Deac was hoping to avoid, because it's a very risky thing to do. You miscalculate one thing in these sorts of lines, and you might just find yourself down a pawn. So Deac sort of kicks the can down the road in this position, plays this other move, knight e4. d4 would have been sort of an incredible way to solve all the problems. You can't really blame Deac for missing all of these calculations. I mean, obviously, I have the line with the help of an engine, but it goes to show sort of the error in thinking that might be going on here. If you calculate this line and you see this line, it's very easy to still not go with it because it's sort of long, it's complicated, and you're playing Alex Grischuk. So you might think, you know, if I calculated one little thing wrong, then this line is not going to go well for me. So instead, Deac chooses a simpler move, knight e4. But of course, by playing knight e4, you have not yet solved your problem, and you do have to continue playing with accuracy to avoid just going down this pawn on d5. So knight e4, of course, resolves the tension between these bishops. Grischuk opts to simply capture on e7, and we get knight takes e7 back. Grischuk now just keeps up the pressure with the move knight to d4. Of course, this pawn's defended enough times, and if we take here, once again, black is happy to take back on the b2 square, getting rid of this weakness. In fact, maybe you could even take here first. And now I'm thinking with my own brain, because the engine causes the stream to lag. But the reason to do this would be to be attacking this a pawn as well. So black finding some dynamic equality here, if white got the bright idea to take on e4. So instead, we see Grischuk going for knight d4 instead. Now, Deac chooses to resolve the tension between these knights, not letting Grischuk have a second shot at taking on e4. See knight takes c3, and Grischuk simply plays queen takes c3, keeping this c-pawn off of the open c file and keeping it from becoming a more permanent weakness. Rook a to c8 now is played in the game, and we get queen d2. But this problem of the pawn on d5 seems to be persisting in this position. So sort of this nagging weakness for black, and while it's not really enough to lose the chess game just yet, you sort of just psychologically want this problem to be gone. You want some way to solve this problem. And so Deac continues trying to play to solve all the problems with knight f5. Grischuk again continues simply with bishop f3. And now we see rook c4. And at this moment, by not resolving the problems earlier with d4 by going for a simpler line, Deac is actually perhaps going for a worse way to solve the problem of the d-pawn with this maneuver, knight f5, rook to c4. What do I mean by that? Well, of course here, white can actually take this pawn on d5 by playing knight f5, and bishop takes d5. What was Deac's point? Well, the point is this rook is opposite the queen, and this bishop is pinned and difficult to unpin. But, of course, this variation is coming with some risk. If you don't play accurately, you have now sacrificed your pawn and are not really cleanly getting it back just yet. So that's why I think it's important to talk about this idea of d4 way back on move 14. Right? This was the cleanest way to, yes, sacrifice the pawn temporarily, but then if you calculate correctly, you can see the tactics needed to get the pawn back. And by not playing it here, by kicking the can down the road and taking the risk with knight f5 and rook c4 instead, Deac actually puts himself in a position where it can be very, very difficult to fully equalize. We see knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, bishop takes d5, and bishop e6 is now Deac's idea. So, of course, this puts white in an awkward spot. This bishop is attacked twice by a rook and a bishop, and not really adequately defended by white's pieces. The only move, of course, is e4 to defend this bishop. And now, once again, I don't really like the move that Deac chooses here. So, it's so close, you can almost kind of feel it with the black pieces here. You have very, very nearly reached equality. You just have to find some way to use the tactical advantages involving this pin, involving this loose bishop. You have to find some way to use those to get your pawn back. But Deac, unfortunately, could not quite find the correct way to follow through with so little time left on the clock. Great Wolf says, seems black is trading a lot, isn't the side with the isolated pawn, trying to keep pieces on for attacking potential. So that's kind of the more ambitious way to play, and if you see players with the white pieces going for an isolani, very often that follows with some kind of attack either in the center or on the king side. Players with the black pieces, especially at a super high level, a lot of times they are content with finding some way to trade off some pieces and finding a way to get rid of their isolated pawn. You know, trade it off for another pawn and find some sort of equality, right? So that's why we see Deac perhaps not keeping all the pieces on the board. So black to move here, chats. What do you think the path to equality should be? Black to move in this position. And not many suggestions from the chat so far. This one seems to be tough. So keep in mind, I think the only way to fully equalize here is if we do regain our pawns somehow. If you get any kind of position where white is just going to keep an extra pawn, you're not going to be fully equal. And yeah, now my chat's catching up. So Chess Bunzo says, bishop takes d5 question mark. I think we can win the pawn back. And that is the pivotal question in this position. I think Deac was thinking along the lines of Chess Bunzo, and perhaps had a little bit more of a concrete idea whether or not he could win the pawn back when he chose the move bishop takes d5. Unfortunately, though, you do have to be very, very accurate in order to keep white from maintaining an extra pawn after bishop takes d5. And the line that Deac chose actually wasn't quite good enough. So the simplest idea here, I think, is to go ahead and play rook takes e4, capturing the pawn back like this. White, of course, really has no option but to take the rook, sacrifice the queen, and go for this endgame with 2 rooks versus the queen. Fortunately, though, for black here, it's going to be really, really difficult to kind of press at all in this position with the white pieces, in my opinion. Why is that? Well, I think you can't really make too many concrete threats. Black is going to play g6, getting rid of any back rank mate ideas. You can try doubling up. I'm going to play just king g7. Getting to the back row isn't going to do you much good because you're immediately going to be sacrificing your own pawns here on the queen side. You know, in moves like this, really you're playing to lose here with white more than you're playing to win. Even ideas like this are never checkmate. The king can simply run out, and there's not enough pieces on the board for white to go for some kind of attack. Oh, not to mention I'm hanging back rank mate. Don't hang back rank mate in your games, everybody. So I think rook takes e4 is honestly the simplest. You get some endgame that I think is entirely drawn. In the game, though, we do see bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and now, unfortunately, Deac did not find the precise move to win the pawn back. So believe it or not, I think there is really only one tactical idea that is going to be good enough for black here to maintain full equality. So some guy with a bunch of numbers for his name in the chat says, no weakness for white, and rooks are better than the queen. So in this case, I think that, you know, while you don't have a weakness like a double pawn or anything, black is able to maintain equality just because the queen is going to be able to very easily apply pressure to these queenside pawns, and the white rooks are never going to be able to invade without leaving these pawns behind. So white has quote-unquote no weaknesses, black also has no weaknesses, and are the rooks better than the queen? You know, artificially maybe, but in practice in this endgame, there's really nothing to play for there. If white had a dark squared bishop, then it'd be dangerous. I might agree with that. Gabriel Harris says, rook d6 and slowly gang up on the pawn. So what's the problem with the slower approach in this case? What if I play a move like rook d6? Well, as white here you do have sort of a nice way to continue to press for an advantage. Let's say I play a move like h3 first. And the reason I'm going to play a move like h3 here is because I'm thinking about the position that comes after. What happens after you win your pawn back is what I'm interested in here with the white pieces. And what happens after is I want to be using my major pieces to invade the 7th rank and pick up your other pawns while you're busy capturing my pawn. And that is the reason why white is going to maintain some advantage here. If you play slowly, yes, you might be able to win the pawn back, but you're going to be losing something in return for it. I'm not sure rook h3 is the most accurate, by the way. Let's start with something like rook c1 first even. So let's say rook c1. What are you going to play with black here to get your pawn back? Are you going to play rook c5? Are you going to play rook c5, everybody? Somebody say yes. Let's look at rook c5, why don't we? So what's the problem with playing like this? Well, first and foremost, I actually don't know if you're even getting your pawn back. I can simply play queen d4, and you have attacked the d pawn as much as you possibly can, and I have defended it just as many times, and so you don't get the pawn back here. So playing slowly, not going to be good enough. By the way, this other move, h3, I think is likely also going to be edge for white in this case. For example, the move queen e3, and if you take here, well, actually, I'm making a threat, so you can't even take there. And I'm going to be able to build up over here with moves like b4, and again, moves like rook c1 to follow. So in the game, Deac plays this move queen b5. But again, this turns out to be slightly too slow in this position. So we need something more faster, some would say, with the black pieces. So what can we do? How can we get there faster? b4 after rook d6 is another fine move. Just, it's not so easy to get this pawn back. Rook d4 would be a great move if it didn't hang a rook, but it does hang a rook, so it's not such a good move. So Alberto has the correct first move, but what's the idea? And Rithwick has the full idea here. We need to attack this pawn as quickly as possible, and we actually have a very clever idea of using a tactical resource to gain back this pawn. And this is what tactics look like sort of at the very high level. Yeah, black has a ton of different ways to go after this pawn, and we see queen b5 in the game as one of those ways, but you use your other resources in the position, not necessarily like as your only threat, but use them as a means to an end. So in this case, we need to attack this pawn somehow. So right now, we're threatening rook c5. White's only try to stop rook c5 is going to be b4. If you play rook c1, I'll take and... well, hold on. If you play rook c1, I'll take d5. That's the tactic there. If you take my queen, I'll take back. If you take one rook, I'll take the other, and you get checkmated. So rook c1 not going to be good enough. So how else can we stop rook c5? Well, you have to play b4. And now black has this tactical idea to reroute this rook somewhere a lot better, and that's rook h4, threatening checkmate, h3 or g3, and now rook h5. And thus, black is successfully regaining the pawn. A lot of work just to take back this weak pawn on d5. Instead, of course, Crusoe is coming from another YouTuber, Gotham Chess's recap. I think this game might have. I don't think this one made it to Agenmater's channel just yet, so hopefully I'm coming in before the really popular guys. Although I guess Gotham Chess is maybe more popular now. Unclear. But anyways, queen b5, not going to get it done. Queen d6 was the accurate way to get this rook into position and regain this pawn. So queen b5 chosen instead. And now we need some way to press for an advantage as white. Grischuk, being the monster that he is, has 8.5 minutes on the clock and spends 7 of it to find the move h3. Only Alexander Grischuk would spend 7 of his 8 minutes on the move h3. And of course, I think h3 is the best move. And what does this move do? Well, you saw in all of those previous positions, the previous position specifically, number 1, this tactical resource, threatening h2. Number 2, the other tactical resource involved this back rank mate. So Grischuk says, all right, I'll spend my 7 minutes, I'll stop the back rank mate, and now it's my opponent's turn. So now the problem for black is that this queen is also not blockading this pawn, so if you go after it with rook c5, we're simply going to push to d6. Now if you go after this guy again, white is simply going to play b4, and the problem now is that if you attack this pawn again, either with queen b6 or I think even with queen e5, we're going to play this move d7. And now the problem is, if you continue with rook c7, we get a similar endgame to the one that we were looking at with the 2 rooks, but very significantly, our rooks have invaded in this position. So this really wasn't an option with the bishops on the board. The bishop on e6 really controlled a lot of the squares, kept the rooks out forever, but now, of course, this is going to be a pretty significant advantage for white. Your rooks are simply too active, and you are going to be taking black's pawns. So that's why the simple approach doesn't work with just capturing. So we see Deac using the rook instead to blockade. But now we've already seen that rook d6 initially was a little bit too slow. We get b4 by white here, stopping rook c5, and now black has simply no comfortable way to attack this pawn. He tries the slow approach once again with rook c7, and now we know that black is going to play rook d7 on the next move, trying to regain the pawn. So as Grischuk now, we know black's plan. How can we keep up the pressure? How can we leverage this extra pawn into something more? Sean says, would black try to win a3 and b4 there? So in that queen versus 2 rooks ending, the problem is once your f and g pawns are gone, white is going to be taking pawns and also threatening checkmate, right? The 2 rooks are able to threaten some pretty nasty things against the black king. So if the queen strays too far, with something like queen a4 in those kinds of positions, you're definitely running a bit too much of a risk there. Stev says queen e3. Blaze says queen d3 with mating motifs. So queen d3 I don't think is going to be good enough. Although superficially that move looks kind of interesting. I'm not sure you're actually ever going to get checkmate. Of course, it's offering a queen trade. But queen e3 seems like an interesting idea. What else can you guys come up with? What else do you guys have? So far, you guys haven't come up with Grischuk's idea, which is fair. Grischuk's pretty good at chess. All right, Aram has the wrong notation, but I think the right idea. So Grischuk was looking to make use of this back rank for black and found this idea of queen to f4 in the game. So why is this the best option? Well, for one, it sort of narrows the range of moves you have to look at. Black's rook is attacked. There's really only one move here, and that's to defend the rook with rook c to d7. And number two, it effectively acts as a pin. So now Grischuk is able to play this move queen b8 check in response to any time this rook is going to move. And with queen b8 check, Grischuk is looking to pick up this pawn on a7. Now, these other moves, I think white is probably going to be slightly better after almost anything. But here I think you're maybe letting black get away with a little bit too much. Just offhand, I think this move queen to e8 looks like a simple enough try for black in this position. Now, why is this a simple enough try? Well, we're going to bring this queen to d8. And now we can essentially pick up this pawn at our leisure. For example, queen d4 makes a threat, so I'll take my time to resolve the threat. Here, 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 and I think I can even get away with taking on d5. So this queen d3 move may be a little bit slow. Probably white's going to be a little bit better in some of the lines, but I think the queen is actually better placed on the back rank than on b5. Queen e3 with a similar idea of attacking this pawn on a7. In this case, I think white is also going to be better just for the same reasons. And in fact, this idea is maybe a little bit simpler than what's played in the game, but we'll see in the game, Grischuk actually manages to get this rook to c1. So you can compare this, where we have the queen on a7 and the rook on a1, with the position found in the game, with the queen on a7 and the rook on c1. So Grischuk basically just finding the most accurate way to bring the pieces in. Either way, still winning the pawn. So queen f4, Grischuk is one to be accurate and gets the pieces a little bit further into the game. Now, of course, Grischuk has a minute 20 on the clock, Deac has a minute 28, and we're going to see a crazy time scramble. So I'm going to blast through the next few moves here. Grischuk, of course, has, at this point, won the middle game battle by getting this extra pawn. Now, is the position winning? That's a different question entirely, and the rest of this game is going to be a little bit of a clown fiesta, as they say, in the severe time pressure. But the really, really interesting part to me was this early middle game, where Deac missed this chance to play d4, fully equalizing, and then not wanting to go into the queen versus two rooks ending that was fully drawn, perhaps fearing any slight risk, fearing that he would get something wrong and Grischuk would take advantage. And by not taking any risks, of course, he took the greatest risk of all and ends up with a much worse position here. But we still got a lot of chess game left. We see g6, queen c3, queen f4. Now rook e1 for white. What is this move doing? Well, it takes the rook off of a square where it's attacked. Never a bad idea in time pressure. Rook d2, queen e3. Grischuk's just trying to keep control over all of the pawns and keep the king safe. We queen back to d6, queen f3. And at this point, it sort of doesn't matter too much what Grischuk does. He's still going to be up a pawn, which is what's making his position perhaps slightly easier to play than Deac's. Deac is just searching for threats, ways to make Grischuk try and trip up. But, pawn is a pawn, as they say. Grischuk at how much time? He's down to 39 seconds here. So queen c7, now queen f6 by white is sort of poking and prodding. Rook d6 makes the queen move again. Grischuk, of course, would be happy with an endgame here. Although, how winning is this? Oh, well, it's super winning because this is a fork. Okay, so rook d7 instead, queen e5. Queen d8, now g3. Grischuk perhaps making some light squared weaknesses in an effort to get the king off the back rank. b6 now marks time. We get a4, rook d4, rook e4, check, king h2, queen a8, and a little bit of scariness, but b5 defends everything. Rook f1, queen d4, and somehow Grischuk manages to not make any mistakes, or too many mistakes, with so little time on the clock. Now we see g4, perhaps giving a little bit too much access to this king, but Grischuk does navigate the complications here. Queen b8, and here, actually, Lichess and Stockfish claim to find equality through the move queen d5, keeping pressure here, and then if you follow up with your threat, playing something like queen takes b6, I think the idea is simply rook d1, and some sort of perpetual check here. So, you know what I mean? It's time pressure. G4 gives a little bit too much access. So black had some crazy tactical ideas. With so little time on the clock, it would be very impressive if either player saw these things. But still worth noting that G4, a little bit of a mistake. You shouldn't weaken your king like that, especially with so little time. But in the game, we don't see this idea for black. Black did not come up with queen d5, instead choosing just to capture the pawn. But now after queen b6, white again has everything under control. If you try this queen d5 idea again, it's just not as strong here. And I can easily tell you the reason because I know what I'm talking about. Queen f6 is the reason. And now if you play rook a1, I take it. And if you don't play rook a1, I might checkmate you. So scary stuff. So instead we get rook f4 and this idea. But now black is just looking a little bit busted here. King h7 is perhaps the final mistake. Now queen f8, and there's no good way to defend this f7 pawn. We saw rook f4 in the game, but these queen endings are pretty much always lost. One passed pawn tends to be enough, especially if you don't have access to the enemy king, and black really can't even make any threats here. So we see h5, queen c6, and the queen unable to stay on this diagonal, attacking g4. Black simply resigns in this position. And that is the Grischuk Bogdan game. Bogdan-Daniel Deac. I don't know what he goes by. I'm sorry. I'm bad. Does he go by Daniel? Does he go by Deac? Deac's his last name. That's not what he goes by. It's tough. I'll call him Deac. So Grischuk with the amazing win. And again, the lesson I think you should take away from this game is that you need to trust your calculation no matter who you're playing against. If you can calculate a way to solve your problems, you sort of have to believe yourself at some point and go for it. Because if you keep kicking the can down the road, keep trying to be risk averse, in the end, you're going to be making concessions, and those concessions are going to start to add up. Okay, so let us move along now. I want to talk about one more game, and that is this one between Fabiano Caruana and Constantin Lupulescu. So Constantin, of course, is the Romanian #1 player, getting his shot at the regular top 10 here in Romania. And my chat room is telling me it's just Bogdan. I'll just call him Bogdan then. Sounds good to me. Daniel is his second first name, which is a little bit of an oxymoron. But okay. So let's take a look at this game. So Fabi played e4. We end up in a French. And this is, I don't think this is new territory for Lupulescu. I was watching the Fabi interview he gave after this game, and he was talking about how in his previous tournament, Lupulescu had only played like the Sicilian or something, but Fabi was really ready for anything. So we get the classical French with knight f6, none of this bishop b4 garbage. So knight f6, and Fabi plays one of the main lines with bishop g5. We see take on e4, knight b7, knight f3. Super normal stuff so far. And Fabi goes for this simpler line with bishop takes f6 rather than knight takes f6 and bishop back to h4 or e3 or something like that. Just trading off the bishop. Now we see bishop d3 here, knight e4, bishop e4, and black pushes out to c5. Once again, we see the c5 move coming into play, challenging white's spatial advantage. In this case, though, black's not ending up with an IQP. Queen e2 is normal. And now after c3, cd4, knight d4, bishop e7, we see the point of white's play with queen e2. The point is that white was looking to castle queenside. This was Fabi's big idea here. Unfortunately, it wasn't really enough to surprise Constantin in this position, but it surprised me. So, you know, there you go, Fabi. You may have not surprised your opponent with this queenside castles prep, but you did surprise me. Of course, a move like kingside castles would look a little bit more normal here, but it's really not going to be too challenging to black's position, I would say. So queenside castles by Fabi, interesting stuff. And I think the idea here, more so than being able to, you know, do the classical opposite side castling games where you push all the pawns and play for checkmate, Fabi has one very specific idea here. But sometimes one idea is really all you need. And Fabi said as much sort of in his interview. He really has only one idea in the position, but it turns out to be a pretty good idea. It's a pretty testing idea, and Lupulescu was unable to find the way to navigate the complications. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 4, RBI says, take the pawn, LOL. And you've fallen for Fabi's devious trap. So, of course, now queen b5 check is going to be causing you a little bit, a few problems here. If you play bishop d7, I think we're simply going to take this pawn here on b7 with the queen. Yeah, I don't see why not. Play something like rook c8, running into bishop c6, and it's getting very, very awkward very, very quickly for the player with the black pieces. This is a pin. This bishop is attacked twice. If you take here, I take here. If you take here, I take here. And it's not looking so good. Not looking so good. So rook d8 might be a better try, but then knight c6, and you have very similar problems. So queen a2, not going to be the best idea. You have to play like king f8 here, and white should pretty significantly be better in this position. King is just weak. So queenside castles, and black goes ahead and castles kingside before taking on a2. What about king f8 instead? Okay, if we can look at this a little bit more thoroughly. King f8, and again, not going to turn on the engine because it's freezes my stream. So apologies if I make any mistakes here, but I think we may be able to capture on b7, although that does look slightly risky. Maybe this move knight c6 is already going to be challenging again. Maybe not though. Take, there's bishop a6. Yeah, let's go with bishop takes b7. And I lied, I'm going to cheat. No, this move's awful. I thought I had this here. No, it just doesn't work. Just doesn't work. This is not a double attack. Why would you ever think it's a double attack? So what's the refutation here? What do we do? Simply knight b3. And this queen is like trapped or something. Yeah, looks tough for black. King c2, rook a1 is a simple enough idea. You can't play queen a6. I take it. Play something like rook b8. I think I still just go queen c2. King c2. You save your piece. I think this is simple enough. And black is just never really getting off the ground here. Tough to bring the rook into the game. Tough to bring the bishop into the game. And everything looks quite sad. So not queen a2, but kingside castles. And now king b1 by Fabi. And sort of the opening trials and tribulations here. So Lupulescu then thinks for a while and plays rook d8, which seems like a fine move. And Fabi goes about playing his one idea. So who in the chat knows what Fabi's one idea was? Who knows the idea here? What's Fabi's point in this position? Any 1400 that plays a lot of online blitz will see this idea immediately. Queen f3 or knight takes e6. Way too classy. Way too classy. You put the queen in front of the bishop and then you checkmate black. Easy stuff, guys. Easy stuff. It works in my blitz games. Why wouldn't it work here? 1400s aren't playing knight takes e6. Okay, that's way too classy, guys. Way too classy. Everybody knows. You put the queen in front of the bishop. You play queen h7. That's checkmate. So, of course, I'm only kind of joking here. This idea is a bit classier, and it does work a lot better when there's no knight on f6, and that's Fabi's point here. The knight from the king side is missing. It's an important defender, and when that defender is gone, black is forced to make some concessions around the king side to deal with this threat. So what concession is that? Well, black has to play this move g6, which might not seem like a lot, but now Fabi continues his idea. How do we continue here? Yeah, Mike's seen that one before. I think we've all seen this one before. So Blaze says F/G/H4. Choose one. And I guess that's the idea. Which one? Which one? And yeah, Great Wolf has the right idea. We want to checkmate black. This pawn's in the way. Let's get it out of the way. H4, H5, H takes G is Fabi's point. And while this is sort of caveman-esque, it is, you know, posing some questions to black. And that's what playing with the white pieces at the top level is all about. You give your opponent a problem. If they solve it, they get to maybe equalize. If they don't solve it, then you get to win the game. And that's what Fabi's opening prep is all about. Of course, there are no forced wins in chess from the get-go. If your opponent plays well, they're going to be able to equalize. So the best you can do is come up with interesting problems and you know, ask your opponent how they're going to solve them. And in this case, unfortunately for Lupulescu, he did not find the correct way to solve the problems. And watching the interview that Fabi gave after, it's really tough to blame him for not finding the best way to solve the problems here. So as black, I'm not even going to ask the chat room to try and find this one. I just want to show you guys some of what Fabi was calculating. This is what he had to say in the interview. In fact, the best move for black is this move E5. And Fabi was like, yeah, I was really expecting him to find this move E5. I think what he was worried about is I was going to play H5, then after E takes D4. Of course, the bishop is hanging, but we're not going to take the bishop. That's way too simple. H takes G6. Now I'm threatening Queen E7. I'm threatening G takes F and Queen H7, Queen G6 stuff with checkmate. And black really only has one move to solve it, which is Queen G5. So, you know, I think he was expecting Queen G5. And then I wasn't really sure what I was going to go for here, but I think the safe move is F4. When black now has to play Queen takes G6, because if you play Queen F6, of course, this is simply losing to Rook takes H6, I believe it was, among other things. So he plays, you know, he has to play Queen takes G6, and then, you know, I can take on E7, but black has Bishop F5 here. And then what I was calculating is that maybe I have Bishop F5, or Queen F5, King A1, and after something like Rook D7, I can go Queen H4 and have ideas against the king on the king's side. And here I was thinking, you know, D takes C3, maybe I have Queen takes H6, but oh, never mind. My calculation was all wrong, because at the end he just has Rook takes D1, and then I have no threats on the king's side. And that is literally almost verbatim the interview that Fabi gave. So just so you know, up to this point, I think this is the engine #1 line. So if you ever, you know, are curious about the calculation strength of Fabiano Caruana, he's like, yeah, I expected my opponent to play the best move, and then play would have probably followed like this, and then he just says like everything that Stockfish says. So that's what it takes to be world #2, I guess. So perhaps fearing some of these things that Fabi had correctly calculated out, Lupulescu did not find this move E5. And according to the engine, that's really the only way black has to equalize. And you really do have to find all these crazy defensive ideas, swinging the queen over to G5, and then white just has no way to break through, apparently. That's coming from Fabi. Instead, Lupulescu said, this bishop's a really good attacker, I'm going to trade it off, and chose bishop A4. According to the computer, the next best thing was to play H5, and this makes some sense, but I also understand why Lupulescu didn't want to go for it. It's sort of the natural response to H4. You just want to stop white from playing H5 entirely. But of course here, the natural way to continue with white is simply play G4. You know, continue the caveman attack. And it turns out G4 does keep up a little bit of pressure here for white, and black can't really fully equalize. It's tough to deal with this idea of H5 coming on the next turn. So bishop A4 it is instead for Lupulescu, but now Fabi finds the only path towards an advantage. We take on A4, and play H5, continuing to break down the light squares. Black now has to play G5. And unfortunately, with this move, black has made enough concessions on the king's side, enough weaknesses on the king's side, that Fabi can get away with snagging this extra pawn here on B7. Now black, unfortunately, makes a second mistake with bishop C5. By putting this bishop here, Fabi is actually able to force a queen trade and more so than the queen trade, is able to force his opponent into a passive position in the endgame. And he does so with this move, queen c6. And this is why bishop c5 was worse than bishop f6, because now there is no way to avoid the trade of queens. Why do I say that? Well, if you go queen a5, I go knight b3. And if you go queen c4, then knight b3, I think, again, making use of this pin is good. And Fabi, in his interview, again, gave like a 7-move variation, explaining why it works. But, you know, attack the pin piece. Come on, Fabi. It's not that hard. So, of course, now black has to take. And why is bishop f6 better? Well, here you would have this move, queen a5, and this knight b3 idea wouldn't quite be so strong. Your queen can slide across, and the bishop is not attacked. Of course, white's still better there because of the extra pawn, but after this, the queen trade is forced, and now Fabi simply invades with rook d7. Black, for the moment, has the pawn back, but is just way too passive to survive this. f6 was Lupulescu's choice, and this one isn't going to get the job done. We see knight d8 now, hits the pawn on e6, bishop e6. Fabi doesn't even take the pawn, instead going knight f7, ready to snag the pawn on h6. Rook f8, we see the check, and white plays king c2 here, which is the meanest idea, and Lupulescu simply resigns. Why does black resign here? Well, good luck finding a legal move. It's not going to be so easy. Honestly, like, find a move. You can't play rook d8, you get forked. You can't move the king legally. If you play something like rook c8, you are going to run into stuff like, I think the simplest is just the check. Maybe even like rook f7 is easy enough, just picking up all the pawns. All the pawns are just going to fall. And so Lupulescu had seen enough and resigned the game. So really impressive game by Fabi. I wanted to show it off here, and showing that sometimes one idea is enough. You have to find some way to pose a problem to your opponent, and in this case, one problem was enough. It was a very difficult problem to solve, and Lupulescu did not manage to solve it. So good game for Fabi. Of course, in this previous round that happened this morning, US time, Wesley So actually managed to defeat Fabi with help from God, according to Wesley. Don't know if he could have done it without Jesus. Wesley thinks he couldn't, but thankfully for Big Wes, Jesus did get him there and took out Fabi. So Fabi back on +0 with an even score after today's round, but still an impressive game nonetheless. And we are actually, I think, running out of time here. So let me switch back to my full screen if I can. Oh, no more intro, just my face. Thank you all so much for watching this Road to 2000, from the comfort of my home to yours, I hope. Coming up next is going to be a great stream from Var Akobian. He's going to be teaching another class. It's great to have Var back here on the channel. It's been some time, so be sure to check that out. He's not going to be here for too much longer, so catch these lectures while you can. As always, though, my name is Caleb Denby. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.